Welcome to the Therapy and Prayer Podcast. Here you'll find the intersection between faith and mental health. I'm your host, Camille. I'm a licensed therapist and clinical social worker, but more importantly, I'm a Christian who really loves the Lord. And I'm just trying to navigate this life without falling victim to it, just like everyone else. Here we take a faith-based approach to all things mental health and wellness, because the Bible tells us to guard our heart and mind, and sometimes we need a little bit of help with that. Hey everyone, welcome back to Therapy and Prayer. My name is Camille. I'm your host, and as always, I'm very happy that you're here, whether this is your first time or if you're returning. Hey friend, I hope that you're okay. I hope that you are having a good week, and if not, then I hope that the rest of your week gets better. So take a second, check in with yourself, with your heart, with your mind, see how you're doing and see what you might need. And hopefully this episode can help you in one way or another. Okay, so this topic, I have had several requests to talk about it. And if I'm being honest, I think I was avoiding talking about it. I was putting it off for a while, probably because it's something that I'm still trying to figure out how to work through. Or maybe I've been avoiding working through it in my own life and in my own heart. So I'm taking these requests and suggestions as God's way of telling me, hey girl, it's time to deal with this. So today we're going to be talking about forgiveness. This is something that I think plagues a lot of people. Forgiveness, or unforgiveness rather, is probably what we really struggle with. And there is a lot to be said about it. Even in trying to organize my thoughts, I was having to kind of edit it down. And I think if I said everything that was on my heart to say about this topic, we would be here for like 2 or 3 hours. We don't have time for that today. So I'm going to kind of extract the pieces that I think are the most important and beneficial, and the ones that I think will help us to heal and move forward, and look more like Christ. All right, that's my disclaimer. I say that to say there's probably going to be some parts or some things having to do with forgiveness or unforgiveness that would absolutely go along with this conversation that we just may not get to today. So we'll see how we feel at the end of it, and whether or not it's a topic that we want to revisit. But regardless, I think that today's going to be a really good episode, a juicy one. And as always, I'm praying that I find some of my own healing through it as we walk through this together. So forgiveness is one of those things that as Christians, we know we're supposed to do. We are commanded to forgive. It's easy to say, forgive others like God forgives you. But if anything in this world is easier said than done, I think that forgiveness is definitely at the top of that list. It needs to be approached thoughtfully, because as part of the human experience, it is not as easy to just forgive. You know, we hear forgive and forget, and then we hear people say, I'll forgive, but I won't forget. So then we're like, well, is that actually really forgiveness if you're still holding on to it? But also because when someone hurts us or offends us, it can cut really, really deep, and it can be very, very, very painful. And it's not that easy to just move on past that type of hurt and past that type of pain. And so when we tell people to just forgive and forget and just move on, that can be very minimizing to the emotional turmoil that some of us may have gone through, depending on what we've experienced in relationships with other people. And it's even more difficult when we are faced with the daunting task of forgiving someone without having received an apology or any sort of accountability for what was done to us. That is a big part, I think, of why a lot of us have had difficulty with forgiving people, because we want them to take accountability for what they've done, for the ways that they've hurt us. It feels unfair that they get to just keep living their lives when we're over here dealing with whatever it is that was done at their hand. So that's a big part of it. It feels unjust. And so we kind of stand in that as we cling to the unforgiveness. But in our healing, in our emotional healing, and in our spiritual healing as well, we have to be able to get to a place where we can forgive without an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I know that feels wrong. That feels incorrect. But honestly and truthfully, in order to find your own healing and freedom, really, we have to be able to get to that point. Because when we harbor unforgiveness, it really only hurts us, right? We've all heard the antidote. what is it? Like holding a grudge or not forgiving someone is like drinking poison and hoping that the other person dies. When you're holding on to that, it is breeding anger and bitterness and resentment in you and not in the other person. So for our own sake, we want to be able to get to a point where we can forgive without always necessarily having to have an admission of guilt or accountability from the other party. So today I want to talk about the emotional and spiritual implications of forgiveness and of unforgiveness. We'll probably talk about both of those equally. And hopefully it can free some of us from the bitterness and anger that has been growing in us. So since there's really so much to say about this topic, I didn't really know where to start. So I decided let's just start with a definition. I like to start with the foundation sometimes and really get an understanding of what it is that we're dealing with. I think forgiveness is a word that we hear a lot, but we don't really have a concrete understanding of what it is and what it means and how to do it. So when I first looked up forgiveness, it said the act of being forgiven or something, or like to forgive, right? Like it used the word in the definition. So I said, okay, well, what is forgive? What does it mean to forgive? So the definition that I found is to stop feeling angry or resentful towards someone for an offense, flaw, or mistake. So this immediately made me start thinking about unforgiveness and what it does to the heart, because this definition says that the goal is to stop feeling angry and resentful. And that is a very big task. When we've been hurt by someone, the primary thing that we feel is anger or rage or bitterness, or at least that's what we think. That's what we think it is. But what we know about anger and resentment and some of these more harsh emotional experiences, especially anger. Anger is a secondary emotion. What that means is that there is always something deeper that is driving it, and it's coming out as anger. There's always a more, a softer feeling, a more painful experience, but it's easier for it to come out as anger. So when we immediately start to feel rage or we start to feel anger, what that should tell us is that there is something deeper, something probably more painful, something softer, something more vulnerable that we're actually feeling, that we either aren't able to identify, don't know how to express, or are afraid to express, or it's just easier for it to come out as anger. If you think about it, anger is a lot easier and probably more comfortable to express than heartbreak, disappointment, abandonment. These are really heavy things, very, very vulnerable things. And what we also know is that we as a people have a vulnerability issue, and we shy away from anything that feels vulnerable. And so there is an inherent, there's almost a strength that comes across in anger. It's like hard and tough and like, I don't know, we would rather lean into that side of things than to say, I feel really abandoned. I feel really hurt. I feel very disappointed. I feel heartbroken, because we feel like that's weak. So we have a vulnerability issue. And that, I think, is what also contributes to our unforgiveness. We're angry and we're bitter and we're resentful because we're heartbroken and disappointed and hurt and feel betrayed and feel abandoned. Y'all following? Okay. So if you really take the time to analyze the anger that you feel when someone hurts you or says or does something that is offensive, if you analyze the anger that you feel, you will almost always find a more vulnerable feeling, a more vulnerable emotion. And we have a hard time forgiving because we don't want to be hurt again. So essentially, if we think about it that way, unforgiveness is a defense mechanism. It's a way that we are trying to protect ourselves from experiencing a similar type of pain and suffering. Now, if you have not already, go ahead and take a listen to the episode on defense mechanisms. I think that might give a little bit more insight into the impact that these defense mechanisms have and how they affect us spiritually as well. So when I started to interact with unforgiveness as a defense mechanism, for me at least, that put it into a whole different category, and it gave me a new perspective, because I understand that experience of trying to protect yourself and not wanting to be hurt again. But as we've talked about before. One, we cannot avoid painful experiences. We cannot control whether or not we're going to be hurt again. And we have to be able to trust that we can keep ourselves safe, and more importantly, that God can keep us safe. I've talked to a lot of people about forgiveness in addition to trying to work through it myself. And here are some of the things that I've heard or experienced or even said myself as to why it is so hard to forgive. And I really want to highlight these because, again, we are not going to skip over the fact that this is a really difficult thing to do. When we have a hard time forgiving someone, usually it's because it's someone that we care deeply about. It's a relationship that meant so much to us. A relationship where we felt safe, or we should have been able to feel safe. Someone that we imagined being very close to us for a long time. The deeper the wound, the more loving the relationship was, or the more love you had for that person. The deeper the wound, the more that relationship meant to you. And so we're also going to talk about the element of grief that comes up in forgiveness and unforgiveness. But I just wanted to put that there. Okay, let me not get ahead of myself. Like I said, y'all, there's a lot to be said about this. Okay, so some of the reasons that we have a really hard time with forgiving or maybe with forgiving quickly is that we have this whole thing about like, well, it feels like they're just getting away with it. If I just forgive them and it feels like they're getting away with it, we want people to pay for what they've done. We want justice. We want vengeance. But what does the Lord say about vengeance? Correct. He says that it's his. It belongs to him. But regardless, that's how we feel sometimes, right? Especially if we forgive and there's been no apology, right? They didn't even have to face me after what they have done or after what they said. So it feels like they've gotten away with it, and that feels unfair to us. When someone didn't apologize and we feel like we've been slighted, or there's not an acknowledgement of our hurt, and it feels like we are maybe not as important when our hurt and when our pain has not been acknowledged. I think a big part of why we have a hard time with forgiveness is because we want the acknowledgement, that validation, that yes, what this person did or said was very hurtful and it should not have happened. You would not believe how impactful it is for someone to hear that for the first time. There have been times where people have shared some really painful experiences with me, and they've never been validated just for having experienced it. And so me, not even the one, who was a part of that painful experience, coming in and saying something as simple as, you know what, that sounds really painful and it should not have happened to you. And I'm sorry that it happened to you. You would not imagine how freeing that is for some people just to hear that from a virtual stranger, from someone who is not even involved. So imagine how freeing it might be to actually hear that from the person who caused the offense or who caused the pain. But we don't always get that. And we're not always going to get that. And we don't need that in order to be able to forgive. It would be helpful. It would make us feel better. It would make us more willing to forgive. But it's not necessary in order to forgive. And we're going to talk about that later too. My feelings are still hurt, right? And we feel like by forgiving, then that means that we are then not even validating our own feelings. But we are able to say, you know what, that was really hurtful. That is not going to change with the forgiveness. If you forgive someone, that does not erase the fact that your feelings were hurt and that your feelings maybe are still hurt, and that maybe there are some residual things from this offense or from this interaction that we have to work through as a result. And that can be really painful too, right? Especially depending on the thing or the relationship, or depending on what the offense was. Sometimes when people do things to us that are extremely hurtful and painful and can be very abusive and can be toxic, sometimes the things that we need to find forgiveness for can result in a lot of trauma for us. And that's really significant to say. And I know that when we are told to forgive someone who has caused us extreme pain and suffering, that just feels so unfair. And we maybe feel discarded a little bit in that moment. And so if you are someone who is still carrying a lot of trauma, or if you maybe have experienced a certain level of abuse, and those scars are still very much showing up for you and affecting the way that you're able to navigate the world around you, then I think it would be really important for you to consider working through some of that with a professional. Here's our therapy plug. Here's our therapy plug for the day. Everyone has some sort of trauma in their background, in their history. And if yours was directly at the hand of a loved one, then that is a very difficult type of trauma to walk through and to work through, especially on your own. And so sometimes before we can forgive, or in order to be able to forgive, we have to do some of that internal healing work first. And that's a part of your internal healing work. So the fact that we're still feeling hurt sometimes makes it really difficult for us to forgive and to forgive quickly. So only you know how deep the hurt is for you, and whether or not that is something that that you can begin to walk through and work through on your own with close friends and family, or if it might be helpful for you to work through it with a professional. Because the other reason that we have a hard time is because we don't always get closure. That closure word. What that means is maybe we haven't gotten an explanation, or an explanation that we are okay with. I don't know if closure is a real thing or not. I've heard different rhetoric about whether or not it is. But when I think about what we say when we mean that is we want the person to explain why they did something, or we want the opportunity to tell them why what they did was wrong. We want to feel heard by the other person, right? Because again, we want our feelings and experiences to be validated. And so we call that closure. Again, we're not always going to get closure, and we don't necessarily need it in order to forgive or move forward. And so all these reasons that we just listed, they make it hard for us to willingly want to forgive someone. They make it hard for us to stop being angry, or to stop being resentful, or to stop being bitter. Remember, that's what the definition of forgiveness was: stop being angry or bitter or resentful because of a mistake or an offense made by someone else. There are things in our human experience that make it really difficult to do this. And y'all won't like this, but none of that is really relevant when it comes to whether or not we should be able to forgive someone and move forward. And these are not things that we have as much control over as we would like. I know that sounds harsh. It sounds harsh as I'm saying it. But this episode is going to have some hard truths, I think. And there are some hard truths that we really need to hear about forgiveness. I think sometimes when we ask about forgiveness and we ask about boundaries and should we really let people get close to us, I think sometimes what we're looking for is justification to be able to not forgive and to be able to cut people out of our lives. And you're not really going to find that here, because you're not going to find that in the Bible. I'm sorry to say. Now, let me also say that you have a right to make whatever decision you want to make, but make it with your eyes wide open. If the question is, how can we forgive as God forgives? Then we need to be ready for the response, because God forgives us over and over and over and over and over again, when we have never, not once, deserved an ounce of forgiveness from him. So if we want to know how to forgive like God forgives, we have to know what it is that we're asking, and we have to know what it is that's being asked of us. Now, the human experience is painful. And the human experience affects us on a mental and emotional level. And so we do have to deal with that, because we already know what happens when we harbor angerness and bitterness and resentment in our mind. It gets into our heart and it draws us further away from God. And we do not want that. So we have to deal with the effects of the painful experiences that we have in relationships with other people. So the reason I think it's important to talk about this is because we hear all the time, you have to forgive like God forgives, but we don't always talk about the how or about the why behind the difficulty that we have with it. I don't think it's realistic to expect us to be able to immediately forgive as soon as something happens. That would be nice, and maybe that's the goal. Maybe the goal is to be able to get there quicker. But that's just not the way of the world. That's just, not how things work. That's not how we work as people. That's the goal, but that's not how we work. And that's not to say that it's okay to stay angry, but that is to say that it's okay to do the work to get to a place where you can willingly and lovingly forgive as God forgives. Because God tells us to love and forgive, period. He doesn't say forgive if you feel like it. He just says, love one another, forgive one another. Period. That's it. So we have to be able to do that. And we also have to know where we are with it now. You have to be able to say, you know what? That's the goal, but I'm nowhere near that right now. Maybe the wound is too fresh still. And maybe that's what you're needing to work on. But we have to know immediately that that is the goal, to be able to get to a place where we can love and where we can forgive. That might look different for different people in different relationships, but that's always the goal. Okay, let me get off of that soapbox real quick so we can keep moving. So what do we do then? We want to be obedient, right? We want to forgive like God does, but we have this whole human thing that makes it really hard. And so how do we stop feeling angry, disappointed, heartbroken, bitter, all of that? So like I said earlier, depending on the wound, it's not always as easy as just like deciding not to be hurt anymore. It's really never as easy as just deciding not to be hurt anymore. And so when our unforgiveness is rooted in trauma, again, I think it's really important to work through that trauma with a professional. Now, beyond that, the key to forgiveness, one of the keys to forgiveness is acceptance. This is where acceptance enters the chat. Now, go with me here. Acceptance is necessary for forgiveness because it allows us to move away from needing to feel validated or justified in our feelings. It allows us to validate and justify our own feelings, and therefore we don't need it from the other person. So the best way to start moving towards forgiveness is acceptance, but the road from heartbreak and disappointment to acceptance is a long and bumpy one. I mentioned earlier that there's an element of grief in forgiveness, and in working through some of my own forgiveness, pretty recently, actually, I have really leaned into the element of grief that comes with some of that. Now, this might sound, I don't know, kind of weird or confusing to some, but I want you to do an exercise with me so that you can kind of see what I'm talking about here. If you're familiar with the 5 stages of grief, then you know that the last stage of grief is acceptance, which means that we have to work through some pretty heavy stuff, some really big feelings before we can get to that place of acceptance. So here's the exercise. Think about someone that you need to forgive. Think about someone who has hurt you that you either need to forgive or that you have already forgiven. But think about the offense. Think about the way that they hurt you, right? If you could think of a fresh one about someone that you currently need to forgive, even better. So think about that. Think about the hurt and the person that you need to forgive. So the first stage of grief is denial. When that person did or said the hurtful thing, was it hard for you to believe it at first? Was it hard for you to believe that this person could treat you that way? Did you not want to believe it? Were you a bit in denial about the fact that this has actually taken place? Did you try really, really hard to not think about it at all? That's a bit of denial. Okay, let's keep going. The second stage of grief is anger. Once you couldn't deny the fact that this happened anymore, did you become enraged? Did you become very, very angry and indignant? And did you say things like, how dare they do that to me? Or did you think things like, how dare they do that to me? Were you like flabbergasted, annoyed that this has actually taken place or that you allowed it to take place? Okay, that's anger. The third stage is bargaining. That's when we try to make sense of things. That's when we try to rationalize what may or may not have happened. So did you maybe go through a bunch of different possible scenarios or reasons as to why this thing might have taken place? Maybe they made a mistake, or maybe they misunderstood what you said that caused them to have this kind of reaction. Did you try to convince yourself that maybe it's because they were going through something and that's why it happened? But had they not been going through that thing, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. Did you try to make sense of it? Did you try to create a narrative or a story that would relieve some of the hurt? Or did you maybe think if they knew how much it would have hurt me, then maybe they would have never done it? That's bargaining. The fourth stage of grief is depression. That's when you get really, really sad because the bargaining didn't work. You weren't able to come up with a scenario, or maybe if you're like me, you tried to hold on to this scenario that you came up with until you got some evidence that that scenario was actually not it. So when you never got an apology, did that make you look at that person in a different light? Did it make you sad that someone that you really loved and held dear would hurt you in that way, whether it was intentional or not? Did you feel like maybe you didn't know them anymore? Or did you feel like maybe you never knew them? Did it feel like you lost a part of them, or that you lost them completely, or that the relationship that you thought you had with them is not the one that you actually have with them? Did that make you feel isolated and heartbroken? That's the depression and grief. And lastly, the final stage of grief is acceptance. Once you've worked through all of that and you've tried to make sense of it, but you can't, and you can't deny the fact that it happened anymore, and you analyze your anger enough to get down to the more vulnerable parts of it that maybe leave you feeling a little bit sad and a little bit depressed, that's when you have to ask yourself, what is it that I need to accept in order to be able to move forward, in order to be able to move past this offense? What do you need to accept about that person, about the interaction, about the relationship? Do you need to accept the fact that this person was not being considerate of you, that they were maybe being careless in what they said or in how they spoke? What do you need to accept about yourself? That maybe the reason they reacted and said that hurtful thing is because you weren't being considerate of something that they had going on. Or were there maybe some red flags about this person that you ignored, but you still let them get close enough to be able to hurt you in this way? What do you need to accept about the relationship? Do you need to accept the fact that you're not as close as you thought you were or as you once were? Or do you need to accept the fact that this person maybe had a lapse in judgment and that everyone has lapses in judgment? What do you need to accept in order to be able to move forward? Whether that means that you're moving forward in this same relationship, or if that means that you're moving forward in a different direction. But what do you need in order to be able to forgive and let go of the anger and let go of the resentment, or to heal from the anger and the resentment that was caused by this person or by this interaction? What do you need to accept? But getting to that acceptance is really difficult. And sometimes we have to go through all of those stages of grief in order to do it, especially, again, depending on how close the relationship was and how deep the cut. Walking through these stages can be incredibly isolating and difficult sometimes. And I know for me, I have had to accept and am having to accept that maybe some people were not as safe as I believed them to be, or is not as safe for me as they once were. And that happens too, right? Like, I've had situations where we come to a point in the relationship where we're not seeing each other in the same way that we once were. And I don't believe that always means that, like, oh, you never cared about me, or that, we never were as close as I thought, because I understand that people grow and evolve and change, and we're not always doing that in the same ways at the same time. And so a difficult truth for me has been maybe this relationship is not as safe as it once was. And that's really sad. And then there have been times where I'm like, oh, wow, we never saw it the same way. And that's also sad. So what is it that you have to accept? But that can be a really difficult thing, because when you realize that maybe you're growing into incompatible versions of ourselves, or that maybe one or both of us is still learning to self-regulate. Like, these are hard things to learn about yourself as a person, but having to learn and accept that about another person as well is a whole other story. And honestly, when we have these rifts in relationships, we have to be reflective and look at what we were bringing to the relationship as well, what we were contributing, because the success or downfall of a relationship is never solely one person's responsibility. Every relationship has multiple parties in it, and multiple parties bring things to the table that affect the relationship. And a part of the reason that we have a hard time forgiving is because we have a hard time taking accountability for what we're doing in the relationship. because sometimes it didn't come from nowhere. Sometimes they're responding or reacting to something that we didn't realize we were doing. And just like we don't always realize the hurt that we cause other people don't always realize the hurt that they cause us. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't. And there's this thing where we feel like if we didn't mean to hurt someone, then they shouldn't be upset about it. But we don't always give the other person that same consideration. There's also a whole conversation to be had about intent versus impact. I talk about this a whole lot. Just because you did not intend for something to be hurtful doesn't mean that it was not hurtful. Doesn't mean that the other person does not have a right to be hurt. So if we're going to talk about forgiveness, let's also talk about when we need forgiveness from other people. We don't think about that part when we hold grudges against other folks. We don't think about the fact that someone somewhere is probably forgiving us when we haven't apologized or taken accountability. And it might be because we are unaware of what we've done. It's hard sometimes to say to a loved one, hey, you hurt me in this way. A lot of us feel like that's confrontational, and we avoid confrontation. And so therefore we avoid telling people how they have really made us feel. I'm talking to myself here as well. So we have to consider the fact that we may have hurt some people along the way. Some of those people that, we're not as close with anymore. We don't really know why. We just kind of drifted apart. There is a possibility that we may have done something to contribute to that, even if we didn't mean to. And would you want someone to hold it against you and to not forgive, especially if you didn't mean it? And wouldn't you want the opportunity to apologize or to take accountability if you did unintentionally hurt someone that you love? So if we're going to talk about forgiveness, we have to look at both sides of the coin. We have to look at how we forgive other people and how we have been forgiven by others and by God. So think about the acceptance as learning to accept the flaws maybe that are being revealed in another person, learning to accept the other person's humanity and imperfection. Also learning to accept that maybe you weren't the wisest in deciding who to allow into your space or who to allow to get close to you. All right, now, if we're going to talk about it, we're going to talk about it. Because in that case, you also have to be able to forgive yourself. Now, as I was studying about what does the Bible say about forgiveness and really what does the Bible say about relationships, I was in the book of Proverbs and I found a lot about making wise decisions in relationships. And I think that if we can learn how to navigate relationships in general with more wisdom, then we won't have as much of an issue with forgiveness and unforgiveness. Forgiveness won't be as much of an issue when we use wisdom and discernment with the people that we consider safe or the people that we allow to get close to us. When we stop overlooking some things, right? Or when we stop thinking that we're the exception, that they might treat other people that way, but they're not going to treat me that way. When we stop overlooking those things, and it'll probably be easier for us to forgive, or we may not have as many instances where we might need to forgive, right? Now, of course, these are talking about people that we choose to keep close to us. Again, there's probably a whole other conversation about people that we did not choose but are in our lives and that maybe we were born into our lives. We're talking about family here. We're talking about folks that you don't really have, or you have not had much of a choice on their proximity to you. And I don't think we have time to get into all of that today, but specifically when we're thinking about like friendships, romantic relationships, or people who we have invited into our space, this is really where we can apply a lot of the wisdom that is spoken about in Proverbs. Because I think that sometimes we don't want to forgive because in doing so, we might have to admit that maybe we made a poor decision. And we really, really, really don't like being wrong. As much as we don't like being out of control, we do not like being wrong. And sometimes forgiving someone or forgiving yourself means that you are admitting that maybe you made a poor choice or a wrong decision. And that one is tough. So just skimming through the book of Proverbs, right? Here are just a few things that are said about wisdom in relationships. We ought to have sound judgment and discernment. Love covers all wrong. Not some of it. Love covers all wrong. We ought to be cautious in friendships, meaning cautious in the friendships that we choose and cautious in how we navigate and move through friendships. We have to be open to correction or rebuke from our own loved ones. Pride and arrogance lead to unforgiveness. So earlier when I was talking about not wanting to be wrong, that's the pride and arrogance that leads to unforgiveness. Covering an offense promotes love, meaning not broadcasting an offense or not continuing to talk about it. That shows love. We ought to have good judgment and love our friends because God is a righteous judge, and so we need to let him judge. Now, some of these things, as I'm saying them, they probably sound like, yeah, duh, okay, sure. But how do we actually apply those? When the Bible says that love covers all wrong, what does that mean? That means that we don't really get to be selective in which wrongdoings we're going to extend love to or which people we're going to extend love to. That's not what that means. But it also means that we need to be cautious with who we allow to get close to us, who we share certain things with. We're not just out here being frivolous and being besties with every person that we come across. No, because we need to use discernment and sound judgment. That's a lesson that can be hard to learn, but once you learn it, it's so valuable. And once you learn it, you never really forget it. So in general, I think we can afford to be a little bit more selective in who we allow to get close to us and in the way that we navigate and make decisions within close relationships. That's how we can apply that wisdom. But honestly, we gain wisdom from experience and from what we learn from those experiences, which means that in order to get that kind of wisdom about our friendships and relationships, we're probably going to have to go through some painful ones first. But if we can minimize the amount of painful experiences that we have to go through, then let's learn from the wisdom that has already been laid out for us in the Bible, right? There's plenty. And honestly, I was just skimming through Proverbs, and these are some of the things that I picked out. And that's only one book in the Bible, okay? So if all of this just came from skimming through one book in the Bible, there's a lot more in there that could be helpful when we consider how we ought to be dealing with one another. So I was thinking about examples of forgiveness in the Bible, and honestly, one of the ones that stands out the most to me and that I think is a great example of forgiveness and one that we probably wouldn't want to emulate, but that we need to try to emulate is David and Saul. Now, if you are familiar with the story of King David and Saul, then you know that Saul was David's number one hater from pretty early on. As soon as King Saul realized the kind of favor that David had, he was after him, and David was number one on his hit list, okay? He had it out for David as soon as he realized how much favor he had. And having it out for somebody back in those days meant that Saul tried to kill this man multiple times. He tried to kill him multiple times and was not successful. Now, what we also know is that by this point, when David comes along, Saul has lost favor with God. He's turned away from God and he's lost favor. And I believe that one of the reasons that David was so forgiving was because even though Saul had lost favor with God, David knew that at some point he was God's chosen and he was God's anointed. God anointed Saul as king before he fell out of favor with him. And David knew that, and David was still able to see him as someone chosen and anointed by God. He was still able to see him as someone who bears the image of God. And that's one of the things that we have a really hard time with. When someone hurts us, we stop seeing them as an image bearer. We stop seeing them as someone that God also loves. So David knew that Saul tried to kill him. This wasn't a secret. Like Saul like threw a spear at him multiple times and he just missed, right? But David always had love for Saul. He never spoke poorly of him. He was still loyal to him as king. And he forgave him over and over again. And he kept, like, I was really flabbergasted when I read that even after Saul tried to kill David, that David was like still there, that he was still like in his presence. Now, at a certain point, he did have to put some distance between he and Saul. But even as a part of that story, there were multiple times where David had an opportunity to get his lick back. There were multiple times where David could have killed Saul. He spared Saul on purpose and said to Saul, "Look, I didn't hurt you. I didn't kill you because I don't want to do that, because I love you, because I have love for you." Right? And part of the reason that we have a hard time forgiving is because we want the other person to hurt. We want them to feel what we felt, right? But this example does not show any of that. This example shows that we ought to show grace and mercy to those who hurt us, right? David showed a great amount of mercy to Saul. Now, at a certain point, David had to flee because Saul was going to kill him on sight, even though they had gone through all of this. Multiple times Saul said, "I'm not going to hurt you anymore. I'm not going to try and kill you anymore," and went back on it multiple times. So there came to a point where David had to put some distance between he and Saul for his own safety, but it grieved him to do so because of the love that he had for Saul, because he knew that he was one of God's anointed at one point. That to me is really mind-blowing, but that to me is the picture of forgiveness that we should really be trying to emulate. And that's the one that we really don't want to emulate, because we really feel like, we've got this like 3-strike rule. And for me, oh gosh, this was bad. I was like, please, I got 2-strike rule. Okay. Very much fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. But that does not come from the word. That comes from the world. Okay. And that perspective is pretty self-centered. Fool me once. You're making a fool of me. You're making me look bad. You're making me feel bad. Our unforgiveness comes from a selfish place. Our unforgiveness oftentimes comes from our self-centeredness. We don't want to look dumb. We don't want to look dumb. Don't make a fool of me. You got me out here looking stupid. You playing in my face. That's the pride that we talked about that leads to that unforgiveness. But what would happen if we removed that from the picture? Think about David and Saul. They were singing songs about David. They said Saul killed thousands and David killed tens of thousands. David was clearly better than Saul. He was clearly better than him. He was clearly better than him. He had God's anointing. He had God's favor, right? And so he could have easily said, "This man got me out here looking crazy." But he didn't. He knew what he had, and he knew what God had given him, and he knew the relationship that he had with God. And he did not feel threatened by someone else's opinion of him. Let that one sit in. He did not feel threatened by someone else's opinion of him or by how someone else felt about him. How the other person felt about him, right? Saul was envious, and so that caused him to literally try to kill David. That is what moved him to be hurtful and to be harmful, was his own envy. But think about it this way. How far must someone be from God to be so moved by their envy that they're really trying to take you out? Can we find some sympathy for that? I think about how difficult and how isolating and how cold of an experience it must be to be that far from God. And so when people are doing hurtful things, whether they are malicious or not, but especially if they're malicious, think about how far they must be from God and how sad it is to be that far from God. Why do you think that we're commanded to forgive? It's so that we don't allow the anger and malice and bitterness and resentment to keep us far from God. So if someone else is doing hurtful things to you repeatedly, where do you think they are in relationship to God? Now, of course, that's not really for us to say, but if we know that their intention is not pure, if we know that their intention is malicious and is hurtful, then they are not operating from a place of the Spirit. They're simply not. And for you to hold on to the hurt that they have caused and to refuse to forgive because you want to get your lick back, or because you want them to feel as bad as you felt, or because you feel like it's not fair and it's unjust, then what space are you operating from? And how does that make you different from the person who intentionally hurt you? Now, that's talking about those who intentionally hurt you. That's talking about those with malicious intent. But remember, we talked about intent versus impact. I think more often than not, the hurt and pain that we experience was unintentional from other people. I really don't think as many people have malicious intent towards us as we feel. But that bargaining that we talked about in the grieving process is what leads us to say things like, they were always jealous of me. They always had it out for me. And I guess sometimes that might be the case. But what I've learned in my own personal experience and from working with other people is that the hurt that we experience from the hands of other people is not intentional, and is maybe an outpouring of some pain that they're experiencing. And the bottom line is that we are commanded to forgive because God forgives us. I'm so thankful that God does not harbor anger and resentment and bitterness and malice towards me because of the ways that I've sinned against him repeatedly. I'm so grateful that he doesn't. And if the God of the universe, the creator of the heavens and the earth, is not too proud to forgive me when I don't deserve it, then what gives me the right to be too proud to forgive someone who I don't think deserves it? Who do I think I am? What gives us the right? It's not circumstantial. Whether or not we should forgive is not circumstantial. That's another hard truth that we really need to internalize. God doesn't say forgive only if the person is really, really sorry. Forgive only if they said that they didn't mean it. He says love covers all wrong. All wrong. We are to show love to all people at all times. Because that's what God does to us. That's what God does for us. Because he loves us. All right, so let's move on to our scripture of the day. This is coming from Ephesians 4:31 through 32. It says, "Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, just as God in Christ also has forgiven you." The instruction is given to everyone. It's not only given to you. I know sometimes when we've been hurt, it feels unfair because it feels like, why do I have to keep being the bigger person? Why do I have to be the one who keeps forgiving and who keeps going back? Y'all both supposed to be forgiving each other. The commandment is given to everyone. So again, if we're using wisdom and if we're seeking like-minded people, then that means that we are also in communion with people who are trying to intentionally be kind and tenderhearted and loving. So if both parties are trying to be kind and tenderhearted and loving, and then there is an offense that happens, I think it's easier to forgive when you understand that person's heart. When you know that they're coming from the same place that you're coming from, that they're trying to serve the same God that you're trying to serve. But the commandment is given to everyone. We don't get to pick and choose. Okay. And just because someone else maybe is not being as tenderhearted and loving does not give you permission to put it on hold until they get right. That's not how that works. When we hoard bitterness and anger, we're only hurting ourselves and we're allowing the enemy to take up more room in our hearts. And we don't want that. Okay. He's taken up enough room and his eviction notice is expired at this point. He's got to go. Okay, I actually have another verse. This is Luke 17:3-4. "Be on guard. If your brother sins, rebuke him. And if he repents, forgive him. And if he sins against you 7 times a day and returns to you 7 times, saying, I repent, forgive him." Now, I know we talked about forgiving without that apology, right? And without that accountability. And we do have to do that sometimes for our own sake so that we're not allowing that anger and bitterness to take root. But especially in the case where you know that the other person is sorry, where they have repented and where they have asked for forgiveness, you have to forgive them. It says it right here. "And if he sins against you 7 times a day in one day, and if he returns to you 7 times, saying, I repent, I'm sorry, please forgive me," asking for forgiveness, you forgive him. What's the verse that says we're supposed to forgive like 70 times, 7 times? We are supposed to forgive, period. There is no cap on forgiveness. Let that sink in. There is no cap on forgiveness, especially when the person who is asking for the forgiveness is doing it with sincerity of heart. Because I know God has forgiven me for the same thing over and over and over again. I know there's been times where I've sinned against God 7 times in a day and he's forgiven me every single time. So again, if God can forgive, then we ought to be able to forgive. That's it. Point blank, period. There's no getting around it. Okay. Okay. This is getting long, so let's keep moving. We are finally at our question of the day. Just as a quick reminder, if you have a question that you want to be answered on the show, you can send me an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. You can leave a comment wherever you're listening or watching this. You can send me a DM on Instagram, on TikTok, any of that. Wherever you can find me, send me your question. I want to be able to answer it. And if you have any prayer requests, go ahead and send those. Put them in the comments below so that we can be praying for one another as we're all walking through these things together. Okay. Today's question. How do we forgive ourselves in the way we know God does? The shortest answer that I have is we have to learn to love ourselves in the way that God does. That's it. We have a hard time forgiving ourselves because we have a tendency of holding on to the guilt and shame that we feel. We have a tendency of punishing ourselves longer than we need to, way longer than God is doing. We have a tendency of punishing ourselves after God has already forgiven us. And it's because of how we feel about ourselves and what we feel that we are worthy of and what we feel that we deserve. We don't see ourselves in the same way that God sees us. And if we could learn to see ourselves with the love and care and compassion that God sees us with, I think it will be a lot easier to forgive ourselves. God forgives because He knows our heart. He knows that our heart is for Him. He knows that we are simply human and that we're flawed and we're going to make mistakes. He does not hold our humanity against us. So in order to forgive yourself the way that God forgives you, you have to acknowledge your humanity and don't punish yourself for it. You have to love yourself the way that God loves you. We have an issue with love. It's hard not to love other people, but loving yourself, that's a whole other story. We feel like we have to be so extra rigid with ourselves and that we can't get away with anything. It's that perfectionism that shows up. It's that guilt and shame that shows up. And we've talked about those a lot here on this channel. We've talked about perfectionism. We've talked about guilt and shame. And those are the reasons that we cannot forgive ourselves. But again, if God has forgiven you, then why can't you forgive yourself? I know it's not always easy. Just like we've been talking about today, it's not always easy to forgive other people, but it is necessary and it's possible. So, how do you forgive yourself like God forgives you? Learn to love yourself like God loves you. Ask God to help you love yourself the way that He loves you. Ask Him to help you see yourself the way that He sees you. You were made in the image of the Most High God. You were made in the image of the most sovereign God. God does not make any mistakes. He's not making a mistake in forgiving you. The same reason that we have intention with taking care of ourselves and taking care of our body, because our body is the temple and we are a creation of God, we have to show ourselves the same love that He shows us. And that's how we can move towards a place of being able to forgive ourselves and allowing ourselves the space to grow into the person that God is still molding us to be. All right. I hope that this was helpful for someone. I know it was helpful for me. Like I said, there's probably a lot more that could be said about this. But I hope that that what we talked about today is speaking to someone who needs it. And I hope and pray that this can help you move forward in forgiveness. Thank you so much for being here. I love you so much, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of Therapy and Prayer. Make sure you're subscribed and following wherever you listen to podcasts. And if the Spirit moves you, go ahead and leave us a review. If you want to submit a question to be answered on this show, send us an email at therapyandprayer@gmail.com. And make sure you're following us on TikTok at Therapy and Prayer. Thanks again for listening. I'll talk to you soon.